At the beginning of 2024, I made a video in defense of Jake from Disventure Camp, and wow, you guys absolutely loved that video. To the point where it's currently my third most popular video and has the most likes and comments I've ever received on a video. Seriously guys, I know this sounds like typical YouTuber talk, but genuinely, thank you all so much for the support on that video. It's been the most support on a video I've received in a very long time, and I can't thank you all enough. Because of the video's success, I now have decided to make Total Drama, and by extension Disventure Camp, and other indie animated shows inspired by Total Drama, to be a mainstay on this channel. I figured if you're a Disventure Camp fan, then you're most likely also a Total Drama fan. It's just hand in hand at this point. But since the most recent season at the time of writing the script, aka Disventure Camp All-Stars and the Tom and Jake spinoff, has given us a mountain of stuff we could possibly say about Jake, and because I also wanted to see how All-Stars would further develop his character, I decided to wait until the whole spectacle was over to share all of my thoughts, which was a blast. But now that the season is over, we can finally close this chapter on Jake and see how his journey has concluded. Since All-Stars alone gives us a ton of material to discuss here, I decided to merge both All-Stars and the first Tom and Jake season as the events tie into each other. Otherwise, we'd probably be here all day looking over every single moment individually. So today, we'll be discussing Jake's character arc and journey throughout all of Disventure Camp All-Stars and the Tom and Jake spinoff, and also seeing how his character has developed and concluded since our first analysis of him. With all that being said, let's dive right in. The first episode of All-Stars wasn't super big for Jake, as it also had to reintroduce all the other characters, but it did still offer up for some interesting moments for him as well. First, we see that he maintained the bond that he developed with Miriam in their previous season, which I absolutely love for both of them. They were able to both find family that they previously lost in each other, and it's just the sweetest thing. I'm so happy for them. And in the interviews, we also get confirmation that Jake's previous home life with his parents wasn't ideal for him. So when Jake said his grandma was the only one who really understood him, I ended up being correct in that his relationship with everyone else in his family wasn't exactly the best, which is even further confirmed later on in this season.
Called it!
However, it hasn't all been sunshine and rainbows for Jake, as despite their mutual promise last season, Tom hasn't responded to Jake pretty much at all since then. This was a big surprise to me at first viewing, and it's also a very big plot point for the season, and by extension, Jake's character development. The rest of the episode gives us a few more little character tidbits until it's revealed which teams all the contestants will be playing on. Jake is placed on magenta, Miriam is placed on yellow, and Tom is placed on cyan. By the way, just a little nitpick that I had early on this season, you have Team Magenta and Team Cyan, all fancy pants Rich McGee over here, and then you just have Team Yellow. I don't know, it just feels a bit weird to me. Like, you could have at least made it magenta, cyan, and gold, or just pink, yellow, and blue. Those are all colors that haven't been used up until this point. Season 4 has now since used blue, but my point remains. But back to the team selections, this means that at the very least until the merge, Jake is left on his own having to navigate the wild social game that this competition is all by himself. Even if he wasn't on the best terms with Tom, at least Jake was still familiar with him, so that could have provided some sort of security for him. This continues on into episode 2, where after landing and navigating the maps they were given, the three of them all go their separate ways. But not before Jake makes one more attempt to talk things out with Tom. Remember when people were complaining about Jake not talking with Tom in Season 1? Well, can't blame a guy for trying, right? Even though I'd argue he also did try back in Season 1, but let's not get into all that right now.
We'll have another chance to talk. See ya!
Now, with Tom always getting on Jake's ass for not communicating back in their previous season, this does make Tom look like a hypocrite. And even knowing what we know now, yes, it is still a bit hypocritical, even if Tom's motives are later explained more in depth. But as for Jake, Miriam tells Jake that it might be time to move on from all this.
Easier said than done.
Now, if that ain't the case for pretty much every situation that brings up some sort of negative feelings. Later on in the episode, we see him start to bond with Ashley, which makes another person that he can turn to if he needs, now that Miriam and Tom are unavailable due to the circumstances. In the challenge, we see Tom also start to bond with his new teammates as well, especially Aiden, which makes Jake start to think more emotionally rather than logically. And Alex, seeing this, decides to further take advantage of his anxieties to cause tension among the Magenta team. This causes Jake to get into a disagreement with James after James is offended that Jake would accuse Aiden of being unfaithful. This new tension eventually leads to James being voted out 3-2 to 1. You know, James, you possibly could have saved yourself in a 50-50 chance if you voted for Fiore with Allie and Hunter instead of Jake. Just saying. I understand you're upset with Jake, but when looking at the strategic view of the game here, there were better options. I'll bring up this particular scenario again later on, as it does fit into something else that comes later that I want to discuss, but for now, let's just talk about the disagreement between Jake and James. Honestly, I can't really blame either of them for the way they feel. Yes, Jake accusing Aiden of doing something as awful as being unfaithful was not a good look on his end, and yes, James has every right to be offended on behalf of his boyfriend. However, I will at least give props to Jake for trying to get to the bottom of what was going on by communicating his concerns. That is a good way to get through a situation when anxiety and irrational thoughts begin to cloud your judgment. James, however, counteracting this with defensiveness, while absolutely justified, isn't really going to help solve the problem and instead exacerbate it. What should have happened was that Jake and James should have clearly communicated both of their sides to reach a mutual conclusion. Though then again, hindsight is 20/20, and emotions can easily cloud judgment on both ends. And it's not really fair to assume that everyone is going to be completely rational 100% of the time. So in the end, I don't fault either one of them in this instance. But this conflict then leads into episode 3 when everyone deals with the fallout of James being voted off. Jake confided in Ashley that he's not sure what to believe anymore, and he does have remorse about voting out James. Ashley agrees to help Jake figure things out and thus makes one more person in Jake's positive support system. This continues on in the next few episodes as Jake and Ashley continue to become closer as friends and try to figure out the situation with Tom, with some bumps in the road along the way, but hey, they're getting through the storm. And then a new problem arises. Fiore, feeling threatened, decides to mess with Jake's head and imply that Ashley could be replacing him with Allie and that Ashley is only using him. This starts to make Jake worry about Allie getting in the way, and he takes it out on her, thus causing a new rivalry, which then culminates into the painful episode 10 where he's at odds with now both Aiden and Allie, which creates a divide in the heroes that the Villains Alliance takes full advantage of by voting out Ashley. The one person who was willing to sit down with all the other heroes and help them with their respective struggles while also uniting them in a strategic gameplay aspect. Now, if I wasn't spoiled for this elimination by those dumbasses who go around purposely posting spoilers publicly to get on people's nerves, I think it's very possible that I would have cried during Ashley's elimination. Ashley and I just seem to share a brain cell this season, with feeling pretty much the same way about almost all of the characters over the course of the episodes. And considering that later on the constant bickering between Jake and Allie would trigger some old negative emotions in me, and while she was still in the game, Ashley would actually somewhat keep things in order in that regard, which made me extremely happy and relieved to see. Yeah, this just hurts even now as I go back to the season reluctantly for a few clips for this video.
First person voted out from merch is Ashley. That's 5 votes. It's time for you to go. Guess the adventure is over.
Now to bring back up the conflict with James again, because what I'm about to say can apply to both situations. In my previous video defending Jake, I stated that I don't necessarily feel like he did anything outright wrong. Accusing Tom of things he never did, yes, but when you look back on it, Tom also has his fair share of missteps in how everything was handled. So he at least should, hypothetically, share some of the blame, and it's why I don't entirely put the blame on Jake. Here, however, even I will admit that this can't really apply to some of Jake's rivalries this season, with the exception of the bear incident that only served as a means of extending the Jake and Allie rivalry for the sake of drama. But aside from that, we can't really say that the other people involved actively did anything wrong to Jake to cause this reaction out of him. We mostly see this with James, Aiden, and Allie, where they don't inherently do anything wrong to instigate Jake, but instead Jake's anxiety gets the best of him and he only begins to resent Aiden and Allie out of fear of what they could do, which has further caused Tom and Ashley to drift away from him and thus losing their support. Now, even I can agree that this is a pretty big leap to make from a logical standpoint. However, if I had a nickel for every time my own anxiety had me convinced I was going to die from a heart attack or all throughout a certain recent global event, I'd have way more than 2 nickels, that's all I'll say. However, while all of this may explain Jake's behavior towards his fellow contestants who haven't wronged him up until he provoked them, it doesn't necessarily justify this. And as for myself, I will admit, Yes, Jake, you fucked up. But just because you fucked up doesn't mean you can't come back from it, for the most part. And if anyone likes Jake any less for this reason, then that is completely fine and your opinion is valid. However, knowing how previous events in the show have been interpreted in the fandom, I would not be surprised if people blamed Jake for believing Fiore. I don't remember any instances of seeing it myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if that has happened. I've seen it with Alec this season after all. So for this one point in particular, I will defend Jake once again. We've pretty much already established that Jake has some form of anxiety issues, and with a lot of these issues comes irrational thoughts. Speaking from personal experiences and from experiences I've witnessed, oftentimes it doesn't matter how much you try to rationalize these thoughts with logic. You'll still most likely worry at the back of your head that these thoughts will become a reality. It's not always just something to be countered with logic once and then the problem is immediately solved. Sometimes it just doesn't go away that easily. So even with Jake trying to think logically and be reassured by Allie proving her loyalty, it's not surprising to me that he's still struggling to get these thoughts out of his head. However, again, when this becomes a problem is when he starts to take this out on people who are innocent in the reality of the situation. We especially see these in episodes 10 and 18 as Jake seems to revert back to his old ways the most in these episodes. Now, as a diehard Jake defender, even I will admit that these episodes were hard to sit through, especially as someone rooting for Jake to improve and redeem himself, only to see him dig himself deeper into this hole. However, I've seen a lot of people refer to these moments as character derailment. Now, of course, if this makes you like Jake less and you see it as bad writing and derailment, then again, that's completely valid and I won't take that away from you. However, for me at least, it's less like character derailment and more like relapsing, which pretty much everywhere I've seen while looking it up defines as symptoms or general well-being getting worse, even after seeing progress. I've seen this topic be debated on in the context of character writing. However, I personally don't mind going this route too much as it's pretty realistic to real life. Lots of people, mental illness or not, have moments of success and improvement but then fall into moments of becoming worse. I know I certainly have with a handful of aspects in my life. So if you view these moments of Jake as making his character less likable to you, then again, that's completely fine and valid. But for me personally, I can ultimately forgive Jake and these moments, especially after it's shown that he is willing and has put in the effort to make things right again after he screws up. We see this with Aiden and Allie directly, and also with James, but less directly so. With both Aiden and Allie, we see Jake eventually put aside the differences he has between each of them in order to work together to achieve a greater goal. And they each start to bond more in the process of doing so and realize that the other person isn't as bad as they once thought. I can definitely admit that maybe it is a little bit too neutral considering that Jake has been the main one to provoke these situations, and I do think that Jake himself could have done more to earn everyone's trust and respect back. However, due to the circumstances of bigger issues arising, and Jake still putting in effort on his end of the deal, and at the very least, seeming like it's a main goal for him, I'm willing to let it slide with the route that the writers of Odd Nation cartoons decided to take in the end. Which, say what you will about Jake, but I think we can all agree that he at least put in a lot more effort than, say, Yul or Rhea. Speaking of those two, a lot of people seem to find Jake to have done some of the worst things on this show alongside Rhea and Yul. But when you really look at everything, is it really fair to put him into that category? Rhea has consistently been shown to have remorse for some of her actions and given multiple chances to change her ways. But every single time she refuses and continues to double down on her sometimes deadly actions. Yul, on the other hand, may not have been given as many chances, but even in episode 19, when he's at a particularly low point, he immediately reverts back to his old behavior when he feels like he's in a more secure position. And he also knows how to put on the act of being nice and remorseful as seen previously with Brett. And while Emily may have been giving him pointers, this still shows that he can consciously make the choice to change and do the right thing, but because of his ego, he chooses not to. Both of these characters have done deplorable things over the course of the series, which you can argue are way worse than the things that Jake has done. And the thing is that they both can make these choices consciously while also refusing to change. With Jake, on the other hand, he isn't always making these conscious choices, and most of the time his anxiety and irrational thoughts are clouding his judgment. Not only that, but when he's able to come back down to the reality of what his actions are causing, he can and has put in the effort to change his behavior for the better. So yeah, I definitely do not hold him in the same regard as characters like Yule or Rhea.
Just try to be yourself, because pretending to be someone else will only make people never know the real you.
Oh, the irony! It's too much!
Now, a slightly different topic just for comparison's sake, YouTuber Shady Durags has made a handful of videos comparing Starlight Glimmer to Sunset Shimmer. And in one of the instances where he explained what makes Sunset's redemption arc work for him was the clear timeline of her arc. And I think that I can say the same thing with Jake in my opinion that made his arc work for me. In the sense that we know where he came from, we know where he ended up, and most importantly, we know what steps he took to get there. These steps mostly include him recognizing his mistakes, putting aside his previous history, and actively choosing to ignore his irrational thoughts and anxieties in favor of making steps to let down his guard and let other people in. So we know the beginning, we know the destination, and we also know the journey. And while this journey may have been a little rocky, or very rocky depending on how you view Jake this season, and maybe he could have been shown to make a few more steps than what he did, show don't tell after all, but to me at least, I can still see that he made his journey. So overall, while certain moments of Jake this season were a bit painful for me, and this was a rocky journey to go through, it doesn't take away too much from me loving him as a character personally, and I can still say that I am a Jake defender. And personally, I'm still really proud of how Jake's character has progressed. One more important thing that I want to touch upon before wrapping up is the bear incident in episode 14, and everything following up in the latter half of All Stars. Now, up until this point, Jake has had his rivalries with Aiden and Allie respectively. However, we've seen Jake and the rest of the heroes learning to cooperate and put aside their differences in order to stay strong as an alliance of their own and take down the villains' alliance. With this, we see Jake making things right with Aiden and even with Tom. So logically, the next step is to try and make things right with Allie, which Jake is fully open to and willing to do, by the way. However, due to Allie's insecurities of not wanting to look bad during the challenge, keeping Jake and Allie behind, Jake ends up getting increasingly frustrated with Allie and he ends up lashing out at her. And this causes the bear that was sleeping in the cave they were in to wake up and the situation suddenly turns a lot more dangerous. Allie comes up with a plan for Jake to distract the bear and then she just abandons him. And it's not like she did this out of fear or due to panicking and her fight or flight instincts were clouding her judgment. No. She abandoned Jake with a vicious wild animal out of pure petty spite. Now, should Jake have lashed out at Allie for causing them to fall behind in the challenge and bring Hunter into this as well? No. Even if Jake did have a right to be frustrated with falling behind in the challenge, he still had a pretty big reaction given that it was clear that Allie was only acting out of insecurity, and Jake only brought up Hunter to strike a nerve where it hurt Allie. However, we can talk about whether or not Jake was justified all day long. But for Allie to be so petty and vindictive that she willingly abandons Jake in a dangerous and potentially deadly situation out of spite is just something that I cannot defend Allie for in the slightest. And despite Allie still being one of my favorite Disventure Camp characters, this moment just makes my blood boil, even to this day. But anyway, this moment is important for the following episodes as it serves to extend Allie and Jake's rivalry for the sole purpose of drama. Did this really have to happen, Odd Nation Cartoons? Really? If you want to extend the rivalry a little bit more and have certain character points be touched upon in both Jake and Allie along the way in this arc, then that's all fine and good. But did it really have to be this petty, spiteful, immature, and hateful on either of their ends? Surely this could have been written better, right? Despite this whole arc's extension having dug up some pretty negative emotions for me, I can still see something like this working. However, given that Allie and Jake weren't supposed to be in the finale originally, you could definitely tell that the writers were really trying to rush to make this plot work in the end, and it shows. And that's where I feel as if this all falls apart. One of the most important things I've learned over the course of writing my own fanfic stories is that the more time you're given to flesh out a particular storyline, the more you can fine-tune everything and improve on every important detail, thus making the best version of your particular storyline that you can in the end. When you just rush to put something out, there can end up being a lot of things that you wish you did differently, and also that the fans of your work can also wish was done differently as well. And I really feel as if that's the case here, because no matter how you feel about either of these two characters, I can definitely come to the conclusion that both Jake and Allie's characters have suffered greatly because of this not-so-greatest writing. Now, to wrap things up, I like to further analyze Jake's mental state. And so I want to first talk about this one moment in episode 12 that I feel is heavily overlooked. Jake and Aiden are hiding in a tree from a wolf when Aiden comes up with a plan.
I just need you to distract him for a few seconds. Can I trust you with that, Jake?
Okay.
I could die if you don't listen to me.
That's too much pressure!
Hey! Can I trust you?
Okay.
Here we see Jake's anxiety in action. We see him first unsure of the plan that Aiden presents to him. Then when Aiden presents a very serious what-if scenario, Jake starts panicking. Understandably so, as a lot of people with some type of diagnosed anxiety have a lot of worst-case scenario thoughts similar to this. However, Aiden does help Jake calm down again by asking him a more simple question, that being if Aiden can trust him. This helps Jake refocus and come back down to reality. They then execute their plan, and it works. This moment was actually pretty big for Jake's character, at least for me, because we got to see his anxiety firsthand, and we got some insight as to how his brain functions in times of stress or uncertainty. This can tie back into a lot of things previously established about him, and I'm so glad we got a scene like this for Jake. The other thing that I want to mention is the moment in episode 20. You guys pretty much all know what I'm talking about. As he and Allie are upholding their promise to Connor, the two of them have a heart-to-heart about their lives outside of the competition. And here, Jake reveals just how bad his mental state has gotten.
I wasn't okay for a long time. Not that I usually am, but this time I almost did something that I regret. But I'm glad to still be here.
That's right, folks. Between seasons 1 and 3, Jake almost attempted suicide. This is obviously a lot to unpack, but it just shows how badly Jake's mental state has deteriorated before. I'm pretty sure a lot of us can agree that most of these characters could benefit from some type of therapy, and I do agree, especially when one character in particular has admitted to once having suicidal thoughts and ideation. However, at the very least, I can at least say that Jake's mental state has improved significantly since that time period. In between seasons 1 and 3, we know that Jake, 1, lost his biggest chain of support in his grandma after she passed away, 2, was disowned by his parents for a part of his identity that he cannot control, 3, had very little friends or support outside of Miriam, and 4, was pretty much completely ghosted by Tom, aka another one of his biggest chains of support, after promising that they would start to work on healing. However, since then, Jake has patched things up with Tom, gained new friends such as Ashley, Aiden, etc., thus expanding his support system all the while still having Miriam and finding a new support system that makes him feel loved and supported. So yes, while I do think our boy can definitely benefit from unpacking everything he's been through in therapy, he is also in a much better headspace now. Enough for me to confidently say that I think Jake will be okay. And there you have it, everyone. That's both my follow-up analysis on Jake's character and also another partial defense of why I continue to consider him one of my personal favorite Disventure Camp characters. If I wasn't able to change your perspective on Jake, then that's completely fine. I will admit that this video was very subjective at times, and I am more than happy to agree to disagree and respect everyone else's opinions on Jake. Thank you guys so much for supporting me during this little saga, and thank you all so much for 1,000 subscribers! Sometimes I think, wow, I'm a pretty small and insignificant YouTuber in the grand scheme of things. But knowing that I've actually inspired some of you guys and that I've garnered a little fan base of my own makes me realize that I've had more of an impact than I initially thought. I'll be honest, guys, this season was a bit of a roller coaster for me, including emotionally. I've had moments of feeling really emotionally charged at certain moments that happened this season that may or may not be connected to some of my own personal struggles. Don't worry about me too much, though. I've begun to unpack these things with my current therapist, and it's helped me understand things a lot more clearly. However, due to a lot of these strong feelings, this video was a bit hard for me to pump out. And while I absolutely appreciate all the love and support from you guys, and I will continue to be a Jake defender for as long as I live, I think it's time that this particular chapter on Jake comes to a close. This doesn't mean that I'm abandoning ship at all. I'll still return to some of my favorite moments with this character whenever I feel like it, and he will always be one of my top favorite characters of this series. All I'm saying is that I feel as if I've gone over pretty much everything I wanted to say about Jake, so it's time to put this subject to bed for the time being. But don't worry guys, as they say, when one book ends, another one opens, and I have a few new beginnings for this channel that I want to introduce in the near future. With my motivation, I can't exactly predict what comes next, but I hope to see you there for it either way. Genuinely, once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys for all your love, patience, and support. And as always, thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys around. Bye!